They told us it was impossible, that the files had been burned, the witnesses silenced, the laboratories dismantled brick by brick, but history has a way of leaving scars even when the flesh is gone. What you're about to hear was never meant to be spoken aloud. These are fragments stitched together from lost testimonies, leaked reports, and the whispers of those who carried their shame to the grave. The truth begins not in the chaos of war or the laboratories of empire, but in a quiet room where doctors once swore an oath to heal. The experiment started under the guise of medicine, wrapped in words like progress, innovation, defense. But what unfolded inside those locked chambers was not science. It was desecration. Men and women stripped of their rights, their names, even their memories, reduced to nameless data points in a ledger of cruelty. They said it never happened, because to admit otherwise would unravel the carefully woven myths of nations. Imagine the leaders you've been told to trust, signing documents that turned villages into test sites, prisons into laboratories, children into unwilling subjects. Imagine the comfort of your daily life, balanced precariously on truths so monstrous they had to be erased from the collective memory. The earliest records speak of experiments in sensory deprivation, individuals left in chambers of absolute silence and darkness for weeks at a time. When they emerged, they no longer recognized themselves. Some screamed at mirrors, convinced their reflections had been replaced. Others forgot their own names, their own children. Officials claimed they were volunteers, but the signatures on the consent forms don't match the names of the dead. And then there were the injections, mixtures designed not to cure, but to test the limits of the body's collapse. Survivors, if you could call them that, described fevers so violent they shot. Okay, their teeth loose, hallucinations of shadows crawling across their skin, and voices whispering commands that no one else could hear. The official reports spoke of controlled trials. But buried in the margins are notes in trembling handwriting. Subject begs for death. Denied. They promised it never happened, and yet, every time a file surfaces, every time a hidden archive is unlocked, the story repeats. Evidence erased, witnesses silenced, truth buried. But the pattern remains, and those who search find the same conclusion written in the blood of every subject. Science was not the pursuit of knowledge, it was the pursuit of control. The deeper you look, the less these experiments resemble science, and the more they resemble rituals of power, where the human body was stripped apart to answer questions no one should have asked. The archives whisper about projects that blurred the line between biology and obedience. It wasn't just about breaking the body, it was about erasing the will. Reports describe soldiers dragged from battlefields, not to be healed, but to be reshaped, sedated, restrained, connected to wires and machines that measured not their pain, but their loyalty. Shock treatments, not the kind that aimed to restore sanity, but ones calibrated to see how much trauma it would take before a man would betray his brother. A soldier's courage dissected like an insect under glass, each voltage increase a step deeper into the dark question. How do you fracture a mind without killing the body? There are photographs, faded, grainy, almost unrecognizable, of faces staring blankly forward, eyes glazed, posture slack, mouths slightly open. The doctors labeled them receptive subjects, but in every description there's one detail that returns again and again. Silence. These men did not scream. They did not plead. They simply stopped being, like candles snuffed out while the wax still burned. And then, the experiment spread beyond soldiers. Civilians disappeared, prisoners, the poor, the unwanted. Entire groups plucked from the margins of society with the justification that no one would miss them. In secret rooms, they were subjected to injections meant to control their emotions, chemicals designed to erase fear, or in some cases, to amplify it until they collapsed from terror alone. The official story says these were psychiatric treatments, but the results read differently. Subject rendered docile, no resistance, awaiting further application. The haunting question is not what they did, but why? Why map the collapse of the mind so precisely? Why measure the exact moment a human stops resisting? Perhaps the answer lies in the notes scrawled across the final pages of one project. Application to populations possible, mass conditioning feasible. It was never about curing the sick or protecting the soldier. It was about building a manual on how to reprogram humanity itself. The silence of the subjects lingers, carried through every report, every testimony, every hidden archive. It is a silence that was purchased at the cost of countless screams no one was allowed to hear. And that silence is not history, it is a blueprint. There is a corridor of history that most historians refuse to walk down, a hall lined with doors that remain locked because opening them means admitting we were not spectators, but participants. Governments did not merely allow these experiments, they funded them, protected them, and buried them. The records tell of budgets hidden under defense spending, laboratories disguised as hospitals, and scientists granted immunity from justice in exchange for their silence. One such program was said to exist beneath a city that today bustles with life, its streets crowded with shops and offices. Few know that beneath the pavement there are sealed tunnels once used to house laboratories no one was meant to find. Survivors who stumbled out decades later spoke of being kept underground for months, never seeing sunlight, subjected to cycles of light and dark, manipulated to confuse the body's rhythms. It was not medicine, it was not war, it was the study of what happens when you strip away time itself. Some lost all sense of reality. They woke believing days had passed, only to be told it had been hours. Others collapsed into madness, unable to distinguish dream from memory. But in those files, buried beneath the technical language, is one detail that chills deeper than the rest. Subjects who emerged from the tunnels often claimed they had been spoken to, not by doctors, not by guards, but by voices they insisted belonged to people who were not there. The official explanation dismisses these reports as hallucinations, a side effect of sensory manipulation. But the consistency is too precise. Different people, at different times, describing the same whispers. Words spoken in languages they had never learned. Instructions given that they could not explain. Some even claimed the voices warned them not to trust the men in white coats. Imagine the fear of those scientists as they ordered testimony that slipped beyond their control. Here they were, measuring the breakdown of the human mind, only to discover something, or someone, spoke back from the void. Did they silence the subjects because they feared madness, or because they feared the truth of what was being revealed? The records end abruptly, the tunnels were sealed. Officially, nothing ever happened. But silence leaves its own kind of evidence. And beneath the cities we walk every day, silence still waits. The story does not end with tunnels or abandoned hospitals. It moves into forests, remote clearings, and villages erased from maps. Entire communities became living laboratories, hidden not in underground chambers but in plain sight. You've never heard of these places because they no longer exist. They were scrubbed from memory, their names replaced, their people scattered or silenced. One file speaks of a settlement deep in the northern woods, where researchers conducted what they called environmental conditioning. The people there were observed without their knowledge, their food tampered with, their water laced with chemicals that altered perception. Slowly the village began to unravel. Neighbors turned against neighbors, families forgot their own children. Some claimed the trees whispered at night, carrying conversations that did not belong to human voices. By the time the program was shut down, the settlement had already consumed itself in paranoia. The official record says it was abandoned due to disease. The truth suggests something far darker. Then there are the experiments tied to sound, frequencies barely audible, pulsed through the night air to measure their effects on mood, sleep, and thought. In one declassified note, a researcher admits, entire populations can be made restless, docile, or violent at will. Imagine an entire village slowly driven into hysteria, their minds pulled apart by something they could not see or name. These were not isolated events. The pattern repeats across continents, different nations, different decades, but the same outcome: silence, denial, erasure. And yet, small fragments surface. A farmer's diary describing how his cattle refused to approach the well. A child's notebook filled with drawings of shadowed figures standing at the edge of the forest, figures no one else admitted to seeing, even official weather reports from the time note unusual atmospheric disturbances in those regions, strange bursts of static and unexplainable storms. Every clue, every fragment paints the same picture. Science and secrecy intertwining to reshape the human environment as if people themselves were no different from test animals. The most chilling part, these weren't just tests of the body or the mind, they were rehearsals, experiments not on individuals, but on societies. What better way to control a population than to alter the very air they breathe, the water they drink, the invisible signals passing through their homes at night? What better way to make sure no one would believe them than to make their memories unreliable? They promised it never happened. But the forests still hold the silence of those who lived and died as data points, and silence, no matter how carefully buried, always returns. There comes a moment in every investigation where the pages stop feeling like history and begin to feel like a mirror. That moment is here, because these experiments were not confined to distant forests or hidden tunnels. They brushed against the edges of ordinary life, closer to you than you would ever want to believe. One fragment describes a suburban neighborhood where households were unknowingly monitored. Subtle alterations were made, different streetlights installed, unusual tones broadcast at night, shifts in the water's mineral content. Families reported odd dreams, sudden bursts of aggression, unexplained illnesses, and yet, when investigators came, they left with the same conclusion: coincidence. But the documents tell another story. Lists of addresses, medical notes, charts comparing how long it took before entire families began to fracture under invisible pressure. Another file describes experiments with memory, not erasing it, but implanting it. Volunteers, or what officials insisted were volunteers, were shown images and told stories that never happened. Weeks later, they could recall those false events with perfect clarity, even swearing to them under oath. Entire groups convinced of realities that never existed. The scientists wrote with chilling detachment. Collective memory manipulation achievable, applications vast. If you're still here, you've already crossed the threshold most fear to enter. Tell me, would you dare to uncover this truth if it was buried in your own hometown? Would you still walk your streets the same way, knowing someone may have tested the air you breathe, the signals in your walls, the memories in your mind? Because here is where the forbidden archive takes its sharpest turn. These were not accidents of history, not anomalies buried in the past. The techniques were preserved, refined, and hidden behind new names, new progress. New justifications. Today they may not call them experiments, they may call them studies, research, trials. The language softens, but the intent lingers. When you read the scattered testimonies, you begin to see a disturbing consistency. Subjects from different decades, different nations, speak of the same sensations: the hum in the walls at night, the flicker of light no one else sees, the sudden intrusion of thoughts that do not belong to them. These echoes cannot be coincidence. They are evidence that the experiment never truly ended. The closer we move to the present, the harder it becomes to separate testimony from warning. The old archives may be faded, the handwriting blurred, but the patterns they describe bleed seamlessly into our own time. We are told the past was a darker age, that humanity has since matured, that governments no longer gamble with human lives in the name of control. Yet in the margins of reports stamped classified, in documents leaked and quickly buried, the same designs appear again and again. One note speaks of devices hidden in ordinary infrastructure, transmitters embedded in towers, receivers disguised as utility boxes, not for communication, but for modulation. A single frequency, directed not at machines, but at the human nervous system itself. Entire neighborhoods monitored like test chambers, their responses catalogued with cold precision. Were people sleeping longer, arguing more, feeling restless without knowing why? To the world, these were natural fluctuations of human behavior. To those who recorded the data, it was proof that populations could be tuned like instruments. Another report describes trials on memory through repetition, not the crude implantation of false recollections, but something subtler, changing the words in news bulletins, altering small details in public records, watching as entire communities shifted their memories without ever realizing they had been guided. The conclusion written in those files is simple, chilling, and absolute. Reality is pliable when consensus is engineered. You may be tempted to dismiss this as paranoia, the whispers of forgotten decades, but what happens when the very same methods reappear under new disguises? What happens when corporate research, technological innovation, and public policy carry the same fingerprints as projects denied half a century ago? How many times can the past repeat itself before denial itself becomes absurd? The final layer of horror lies not in what was done, but in how easily it could be done again. The voices of the old subjects still echo through the pages, pleas for recognition, desperate warnings scribbled before silence overtook them. And behind every official seal, every stamp of secrecy, lies the same phrase that has echoed through every generation. It never happened. But if it never happened, then why are we still feeling its tremors today? Why do the same methods surface under different names in different nations with the same haunting results? Perhaps the answer is not that the experiments ended, but that the experiment has simply grown larger. The final pages of the archive are not pages at all. They are absences, documents blacked out until nothing remains, testimonies redacted into silence, entire years scrubbed from record. And yet, it is in those absences that the truth reveals itself most clearly. If there were nothing to hide, why erase so much? If there were nothing to fear, why bury history so deeply that even the mention of it is treated as heresy? There are fragments, small enough to be overlooked, but persistent enough to remain. A photograph of a man with numbers tattooed not by prison, but by laboratory. A doctor's private letter confessing that he no longer believed he was studying science but interrogating the human soul. A box of reels hidden in an attic, recordings of voices repeating phrases again and again until they dissolved into sobs. Each fragment is a ghost, and together they form a chorus. The experiment never ended. And perhaps this is the most forbidden truth of all, that the experiment is not confined to secret chambers or forgotten villages. It is everywhere, in the signals that ripple through the air, in the food and water altered without announcement, in the constant shifting of collective memory through repetition and erasure. The experiment is no longer on the margins of society. The experiment is society. They promised it never happened because to admit otherwise would shatter the illusion of order. Nations built their credibility on denial. Scientists built their careers on silence. Communities built their futures on forgetting. But forgetting does not erase the scar. It only deepens it. And if the scar runs through governments, laboratories, and history itself, then it also runs through us. The forbidden archive ends with one note, unsigned, dated but smudged, the ink half erased. If you are reading this, you are already inside it. Do not look for the end. There isn't. T1. And so the question is no longer whether the experiments happened. The question is how long you have been a part of them without knowing. When did the test begin for you? When did you first feel the hum at night, the flicker of light, the thought that did not belong to you? Perhaps the truth was never buried. Perhaps it has been waiting patiently in plain sight. And now that you have heard it, you cannot unhear it, because the experiment they promised never happened is still happening.